It was December 2025. I read a single statistic that made me stop scrolling. The headlines were celebrating. S&P 500 up 17% for the year. Unemployment is hovering near historic lows. Consumer confidence is rising. The top 10% of Americans now account for 49% of all consumer spending in the economy. That's from Moody's chief economist Mark Zandi's research published in late 2025. Let that sink in. Half the economy runs by 1/10 of the people. That's not a statistic, that's a confession. It means the GDP numbers you see on TV, the strong economy, the resilient consumer, it's not measuring your economy, it's measuring theirs. When economists say spending is holding up, they mean rich people are still buying things. The rest of you, you're a rounding error. Economists call it a K-shaped economy. Picture the letter K. One arm rises steeply. That's the wealthy, soaring ever higher. The other arm falls. That's everyone else, sliding toward the floor. I call it something simpler. We no longer live in the same country. There are three Americas now. The have-nots trapped at the bottom, working harder than ever and falling further behind. The haves, the anxious middle class, clutching their mortgages and 401ks, terrified of the drop. And they have lots, a new aristocracy that has essentially seceded from the economy the rest of us live in. This video is about how we got here, who profits from keeping it this way, the risks this poses to all of us, and why the mechanisms that run this machine are specifically designed so you never quite understand them. Let's pull back the curtain, the have-nots, the trap, start at the bottom 50% of American households. That's roughly 66 million families, teachers, nurses, warehouse workers, retail employees, gig drivers, and home health aides. Do you know how much of the nation's wealth they own? 2.5%. That's according to Federal Reserve data from 2024. Let me make that visual. If America's total wealth were a 100-meter sprint, the bottom half of the population has made it 2.5 meters. They're still at the starting blocks. The top 1%, they've crossed the finish line and are already on their third victory lap. They own 30% of everything. That's from the same Federal Reserve data. And it's getting worse. In 1989, the bottom 50% owned 3.4% of national wealth. Now it's 2.5%. They didn't just fail to gain ground, they lost it while working more hours than ever before. But here's what really keeps me up at night. The have-nots own only 1% of all stocks, 1% documented by inequality researchers at inequality.org. When CNBC celebrates that the market hit another all-time high, that news is literally not for them. It might as well be broadcast from another planet in a language they don't speak. The stock market is not the economy. The stock market is a scoreboard for people who already have money. Now let me tell you about something most people have never heard of. RealPage. RealPage is a software company based in Texas that provides rent pricing algorithms to landlords. Here's how it works. Landlords across the country, we're talking millions of apartment units, feed their rental data into the RealPage's system. Vacancy rates, current rents, and lease terms. The algorithm crunches all this data and then tells each landlord what to charge. And here's the crucial part. It coordinates pricing across competitors. Landlords who are supposed to be competing with each other are instead feeding their data into the same algorithm, which then tells all of them to raise prices together. Internal documents from the company said the quiet part out loud. One RealPage executive described their software as helping landlords avoid the race to the bottom in down markets, meaning even when there are empty apartments, even when supply exceeds demand, the algorithm prevents rents from falling. Another executive bragged that their product creates a rising tide that raises all ships. All landlord ships, that is. Renters drown. One landlord reported that within 11 months of adopting RealPage, they had raised rents by more than 25%. Not because the apartments got nicer, not because the neighborhood improved, but because an algorithm told them they could. The Department of Justice sued RealPage in August 2024, calling it algorithmic price fixing, a cartel run by software. In November 2025, they settled. And here's the punchline. RealPage didn't have to pay a single dollar in damages, nor did it admit any wrongdoing. They agreed to change some practices going forward, and that was it. California and New York have since passed laws against the practice. But the damage is done. An estimated 800,000 leases in Washington state alone were priced using this software. That's from the Washington Attorney General's lawsuit. Multiply that across the country. Billions of dollars extracted from renters by an algorithm designed to squeeze them. This is the world the have-nots live in. Rents rise because a computer told them to, while wages inch up 4% and inflation eats every penny before it reaches their bank account. Now let's talk about what happens when something goes wrong in a have-not's life. 40% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency without borrowing money or selling something. That's from the Federal Reserve's annual survey of household economics and decision-making. $400. That's a car repair, a medical copay, a broken phone, a furnace that dies in February. For nearly half of Americans, that's not an inconvenience. It's a financial crisis. It's the difference between making rent and not making rent. And when the crisis hits, where do they turn? Credit cards at 22% interest, payday loans at 400% APR, buy now, pay later schemes that slice purchases into installments while tacking on fees. This isn't a failure of individual responsibility. This isn't about avocado toast or lattes. It's structural design. When work no longer pays enough to live on, debt becomes the oxygen. You can't breathe without it, and every breath costs you interest. Here's a number that should haunt every economist who talks about the quote-unquote strong economy. 80% of stocks are owned by 10% of the population, according to Federal Reserve wealth distribution data. When the Federal Reserve prints money, as it did to the tune of $8 trillion since 2008, that money flows into asset prices, stocks go up, houses go up, and the portfolios of the wealthy swell. The people who already own those things get richer. That's not a side effect. That's the mechanism. The have-nots don't own those things. They own their labor, they own their time, and they watch as the purchasing power of that labor shrinks, while everything they need to buy, housing, healthcare, education, food, gets more expensive. They're not falling behind because they're lazy. They're falling behind because the game is rigged, and they were never given chips to play. The middle class, what I'm calling the haves, is supposed to be the backbone of American democracy, the stabilizing force, the people with enough stake in the system to defend it, but not so much that they can rig it. In 1971, 61% of Americans qualified as middle class by income. By 2023, just 51%, barely a majority, and shrinking every year. That's from Pew Research C-Center's analysis. The middle isn't holding, it's hollowing out. On paper, the haves are doing okay. They own homes, or at least they have mortgages. They have retirement accounts with 6 figures in them. Their wages went up 4% in 2025. They take vacations. They eat at restaurants. They look from the outside like the American dream made manifest. But let me introduce you to the term house poor. Over half of American homeowners locked in mortgages at 3 to 4% rates between 2020 and 2021 when interest rates were at historic lows, and the Fed was flooding the economy with cheap money. At the time, it seemed like winning the lottery, a 30-year fixed rate under 3%. That's generational wealth. That's security. Now, those same people are trapped. They can't sell because moving means getting a new mortgage at 6 to 7%, which would nearly double their monthly payment for the same house. They can't upgrade to a bigger place because the math doesn't work. They can't downsize because even smaller houses cost more now. They can't move for a better job in another city. They can't relocate to be near aging parents. Economists call these golden handcuffs. You're not free. You're just comfortable enough to be stuck. Your low mortgage rate is an anchor, not a life raft. And the anxiety doesn't stop at housing. The haves watch the headlines about AI replacing white-collar jobs. They see layoffs at tech companies, at law firms, at accounting firms. They have degrees and experience and skills, and they're terrified that none of it will matter in 5 years. The have-nots fear they can't climb up. The haves fear they'll fall. Different nightmares, same cold sweat. Now let me decode something for you. A piece of political theater that perfectly illustrates how crumbs are marketed as cake. In July 2025, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's actually what they called it, the OBBA. Its flagship promise, the one plastered on campaign signs, was no tax on tips. Sounds great, right? Finally, helping workers, letting servers and bartenders keep more of their money. Here's the math. And this comes from the Tax Policy Center and the Yale Budget Lab. The tip deduction is capped at $25,000 per year. For a server in the 12% tax bracket, that's a maximum savings of about $600 per year, $50 a month. For most tipped workers, it's less. For a bartender making $30,000, maybe $400 in savings. But here's the kicker. More than 1/3 of tipped workers already don't owe federal income tax because they earn too little. Their income falls below the standard deduction threshold. They get nothing from this policy. Zero. It's a tax cut for people who don't pay the tax. Meanwhile, the same bill made permanent the 2017 corporate tax cuts, which slashed the corporate rate from 35% to 21%, the biggest corporate tax cut in American history. That cost roughly $4 trillion over 10 years, according to Congressional Budget Office estimates. The tip tax break, $32 billion total over the same period, from the Joint Committee on Taxation. Let me put that in perspective. For every dollar spent on no tax on tips, $125 goes to corporate tax cuts. The headline is for workers. The money is for shareholders. The metaphor writes itself. You got a discount on coffee, but your rent went up $200 a month. And who benefits from those corporate tax cuts? The top 1% owns nearly 50% of all corporate stock from Federal Reserve data. When you cut corporate taxes, the companies have more profit. They buy back their own stock. The share price goes up and shareholders get richer. A 2024 study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the 2017 tax cuts increased economic growth and wages by less than advertised, while half the benefit went to the highest salaried employees of corporations, not the workers, the executives. That's not trickle-down economics. That's trickle-up, and the haves are standing in the middle getting dripped on from both directions. Now we reach the top of the pyramid, the stratosphere, the have-lots. These aren't just rich people. Rich people have nice houses and take good vacations. They have lots of existence in a different dimension. They have tax attorneys, family offices, private wealth managers, and lobbyists on retainer. Their money doesn't just sit in accounts. It works, multiplies, and shields itself from the rules that govern everyone else. In 2025, the 50 richest Americans saw their median net worth increase by $10 billion each, not total each, in a single year. That's from Bloomberg Billionaires Index data. Elon Musk alone gained $187 billion, enough to fund the entire annual budget of NASA 7 times over, enough to end homelessness in America multiple times, according to most estimates. He made that in 12 months. But here's what should really bother you. A ProPublica investigation using IRS data found that the 25 richest Americans paid an average effective tax rate of just 4% on their wealth growth from 2014 to 2018, 3.4%. Some paid zero in certain years. Jeff Bezos paid no income tax in 2007 and 2011. Elon Musk paid nothing in 2018. How is that possible? It's not fraud. It's not illegal. It's perfectly within the rules. Because they wrote the rules. It's called buy, borrow, die. 3 words that explain how the American oligarchy perpetuates itself, a concept developed by USC law professor Edward McCaffrey. Step 1, buy. The ultra-wealthy accumulate assets, stocks, real estate, companies, art, anything that appreciates. These assets grow in value year after year. But here's the trick buried in the tax code. In America, you don't owe taxes on investment gains until you sell. It's called unrealized gains. The IRS can't touch it, so the billionaires don't sell ever. Their wealth compounds tax-free decade after decade. Step 2, borrow. But wait, if they never sell, how do they afford the yachts, the private islands, the politicians? Simple. They borrow against their assets. Take out a loan using your stock portfolio as collateral. Banks will lend billions at 1 to 2% interest to someone with Elon Musk's collateral. And here's the magic. Borrowed money isn't taxed as income. So instead of selling under $0 million in stock and paying $20 million in capital gains tax, Musk borrows under $0 million against the stock, pays maybe £1 to $2 million in interest, and keeps the cash completely tax-free. He gets the money, the IRS gets nothing. Step 3, die. This is where it gets truly obscene. When a billionaire dies, their heirs inherit those assets. And under current law, all those unrealized gains, all that appreciation that was never taxed over decades, is completely wiped clean. It's called stepped-up basis. If daddy bought stock for $10 million and it's worth $500 million when he dies, the kids inherit it at the $500 million value. They can sell the next day and owe 0 capital gains tax. $490 million in gains taxed at a rate of exactly 0. As Professor McCaffrey put it, once you're already rich, it's simple. Buy, borrow, die. These are planks of law that have been in place for 100 years. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed for the people who designed it. Now, let me introduce you to an 18th century concept that explains the 21st century better than any think tank report, the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was an Irish-French economist who noticed something about money. When new money enters an economy, it doesn't spread evenly like water. It flows through channels, and whoever is closest to the source gets to spend it first before prices rise. When a central bank prints money, that money enters through specific doors, first to banks, then to large corporations and wealthy investors with access to credit, then eventually maybe to everyone else in the form of wages. The people who get the money first can buy assets at today's prices. By the time you get that money filtered through the economy and into your paycheck, prices have already risen to account for all that new cash. You're always a step behind. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created roughly $8 trillion through quantitative easing. $8 trillion. Conjured into existence. That money flowed to Wall Street first. Asset prices exploded. The people who owned assets before the money was printed got richer. Everyone else got inflation. The Cantillon effect is wealth transfer disguised as monetary policy. In the game of their money versus your sweat, their money is winning, and it's not even close. Now let's talk about why this isn't just unfair. It's dangerous for everyone, including the people at the top. Economic risk first. When half the economy depends on 10% of the population's spending, you've built a house of cards. What happens when the stock market crashes and the wealthy pull back? What happens when their real estate portfolios decline? The resilient consumer everyone celebrates is actually just a handful of rich people buying luxury goods. The rest of the economy is running on fumes and credit card debt. Consumer demand is the engine of the economy. But the have-nots spend everything they earn. They have to. They have lots they save and invest most of their income. When you concentrate wealth at the top, you're removing money from circulation. You're creating an economy where mass markets shrink because the masses have nothing to spend. This isn't theory. The 2008 financial crisis was fueled in part by stagnant wages and predatory lending to lower-income buyers, people who needed debt to maintain a middle-class life. When those loans went bad, the whole system collapsed. We're building the same pressure again. Now, social risk. Here's a number that should haunt you. The richest 1% of American men live 14.6 years longer than the poorest 1%. For women, it's 10.1 years. That's from a landmark study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his team. 14 years. That's not a gap. That's a chasm. It means being poor in America doesn't just cost you money, it costs you life itself, and it's getting worse. From 2001 to 2014, the richest Americans gained about 3 years in life expectancy. The poorest Americans' life expectancy was flat, no improvement at all. As the researchers noted, this gain in lifespan for the rich is equivalent to curing cancer, but only for people who can afford it. Inequality isn't just unfair, it's lethal. A 2024 report from the U.S. Senate found that working-class Americans can expect to die at least 7 years earlier than the wealthy and rural counties with low median incomes. The gap expands to 10 years compared to wealthy urban areas. This breeds despair. The deaths of despair that Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Dion documented. Suicides, overdoses, and alcohol-related deaths are concentrated among lower-income Americans. People who feel left behind. People who see no path forward. Now, political risk. And this is the most dangerous of all. A groundbreaking study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in January 2025 by researchers from the University of Chicago and Techno de Monte analyzed data from democracies around the world. Their finding was stark. Economic inequality is one of the strongest predictors of democratic erosion. Let me repeat that. The more unequal a democracy becomes, the more likely it is to elect what the researchers call power-arranging and norm-shredding leaders. Even wealthy and long-standing democracies like the United States are vulnerable if they are highly unequal. The mechanism is straightforward. High inequality creates grievance. It creates a sense of being left behind, of the system being rigged, and demagogues exploit that grievance. Left-wing populists blame corporations. Right-wing populists blame immigrants. Both feed on the same underlying rot, a system that visibly works for some and not for others. The researchers found that older democracies are not more resilient. Age doesn't protect you. What matters is inequality. America's Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, currently stands at 0.48. That's from the U.S. Census Bureau data. It's higher than at any point in 60 years, higher than virtually every other developed nation. We're at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Political scientists have documented something remarkable. In America, the preferences of average citizens have statistically near zero impact on policy outcomes. This was the finding of a famous 2014 study by Princeton's Martin Gillens and Northwestern's Benjamin Page. Whether 10% of the public supports a policy or 90%, the probability of it passing barely changes. Meanwhile, the preferences of economic elites are strongly reflected in what becomes law. The technical term is oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy. And when people figure out that their votes don't matter, but billionaires' donations do, they stop believing in democracy. They turn to outsiders. They turn to strong men. They burn things down. In 2022, federal lobbying expenditures hit over $4 billion, according to Open Secrets. Tech billionaires, having minted their fortunes in the AI boom, have become what Axios calls the Silicon Swamp, ever more invested in preserving the status quo. A wealth tax is too radical. Medicare for all is unrealistic. Free public college, who would pay for it? But $4 trillion in corporate tax cuts is fiscally responsible. The conversation itself is controlled. If you followed me this far, you might be asking, why doesn't someone just fix this? Here's why. The people who benefit from the system write the rules of the system. Now look at this chart from the Economic Policy Institute. It tells the whole story. From 1948 to 1979, worker productivity and worker pay rose together in lockstep. When American workers got more productive, when companies made more money, wages went up. You worked harder, you got paid more. The deal was simple, and it worked. Then something changed. After 1979, productivity kept climbing. American workers kept producing more per hour, but wages flatlined. For 4 decades, the lines diverged. Productivity grew 3.5 times faster than pay for the typical worker. That's directly from the Economic Policy Institute's analysis of Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Where did that gap go? Where did all that extra value disappear to? to capital, to shareholders, to executive compensation, to have lots. If median hourly compensation had grown at the same rate as productivity since 1979, the typical worker would be making $9 more per hour today. $9. That's almost $19,000 a year that should be in workers' pockets, but isn't. What changed in 1979? Union membership began its long collapse from 20% of private workers to just 6% today. The minimum wage stopped keeping pace with inflation. Corporate deregulation accelerated. Tax rates on top earners were slashed from 70% to 37%. Antitrust enforcement withered. Stock buybacks, once illegal, became the primary way corporations returned value to shareholders instead of workers. These weren't economic accidents. They weren't inevitable forces of globalization. They were policy choices made by people for people, just not your people. In 2024, the post-tax income ratio between the richest and poorest Americans climbed to 9.9, meaning the top earners make nearly 10 times what the bottom earners do, even after the supposedly progressive tax system takes its cut. That's from U.S. Bank's economic analysis of Federal Reserve data. This isn't a bug in capitalism. It's a feature maintained by those who benefit, protected by those they fund. Let me leave you with this. In 1940, if you were born in America, you had a 90% chance of earning more than your parents. 90%. From research by Stanford economist Raj Chetty. The American dream wasn't a slogan or a marketing campaign. It was a statistical reality. Work hard, play by the rules, and you do better than the generation before you, almost guaranteed. By the 1980s, that number had fallen to 50%, a coin flip. And today, for children born to families in the bottom income brackets, the odds are worse, much worse. The ladder has been pulled up, the elevator doors have closed. America is no longer a ladder, it's an elevator, and the button only goes up if you're already at the top. The have-lots have essentially seceded from the economy you and I live in. They exist in a parallel America where crises are buying opportunities, where taxes are optional, where inflation is something that happens to other people, and where the rules are written in their favor by people on their payroll. The haves are running on a treadmill, feet pounding, going nowhere, terrified that one medical bill, one layoff, one AI disruption, one recession will send them tumbling into the pit below. They own homes they can't leave. They have retirement accounts that depend on a stock market that could crash tomorrow. They're one bad quarter away from joining the have-nots. And the hostages were already in the pit. They never left. They work 2 jobs and still can't make rent. They skip meals so their kids can eat. They put medical bills on credit cards and pray they can pay them off before the interest compounds. They watch politicians talk about helping the middle class and know that no one is talking about them. The GDP number you see on the news is an average. An average is a lie. When one person has $10 billion and 99 have nothing. Bill Gates walks into a bar and everyone becomes a millionaire on average. That's the economy we're being sold, an average that hides everything. We no longer live in one economy. We live in several stacked on top of each other, barely touching, barely aware of each other's existence. The K-shaped economy isn't a recovery. It's a divergence. And every year, the arms of that K spread further apart. The top rises faster. The bottom falls harder, and the space between them grows into a chasm that no amount of hard work or bootstrap pulling can cross. This matters because it's not sustainable. The research is detailed. Societies this unequal become unstable. They lose faith in their institutions. They turn on each other. They elect leaders who promise to burn it all down. If you learn something today, share this. Not for the algorithm, though that helps, but because these mechanisms survive on ignorance. The system works because most people don't understand how it works. The more people who see behind the curtain, the harder it becomes to keep it closed. They have lots are counting on your confusion, on your exhaustion, on your acceptance that this is just the way things are. Don't give it to them. Thanks for watching.